Officer, with all due respect, you are WRONG. State law protects us from interference. Stand aside and let my partner do his job.
Are you threatening me?
The August sun beat down on the city, turning the asphalt of Alley 4 into a shimmering black mirror of heat for Chris Jensen, 6 months into his career as a paramedic. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the acrid stench of overflowing dumpsters and stale urine. At 24, he was still learning to filter out the sensory overload of the job, the sights, the smells, the sounds of human desperation, and focus solely on the medical facts. The call had come in as a possible overdose, female, early 20s, unresponsive. Vague. But the urgency in the dispatcher's voice had been a tangible thing. He and his partner, Mark Rivera, a veteran with 15 years on the job and a perpetually calm demeanor, had arrived in under 5 minutes. They found her slumped against a graffiti-scarred brick wall, a pale figure in a sea of urban decay. Her friends, a frantic young man and a weeping woman, were hovering nearby, their panic a useless, buzzing energy. "We just found her like this," the man shouted, his voice cracking. "She was fine a minute ago, I swear." Chris ignored him, his training kicking in and creating a tunnel of focus around the patient. He dropped his jump bag and knelt in the grimy alleyway, his gloved fingers immediately going to the woman's neck, searching for a carotid pulse. It was there, but terrifyingly slow and weak, thready. Her skin was cool and clammy, with a faint bluish tint, cyanosis, creeping around her lips and fingertips. Classic signs. Her pupils were constricted to the size of pinpricks. "Pulse is weak, maybe 40, Chris called out to Mark, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Respirations are shallow, maybe 5 a minute. She's circling the drain." "Got it," Mark responded, already pulling the bag valve mask, BVM, from the secondary kit. "Let's breathe for her." Chris ripped open an alcohol prep pad and performed a sternal rub, grinding his knuckles hard into the woman's breastbone. It was a painful stimulus designed to elicit a response from even a deeply unconscious patient. Nothing. No groan. No flinch. No flicker of her eyelids. She was completely out. "No response to pain," Chris confirmed, tilting her head back to open her airway. He inserted a simple oropharyngeal airway to keep her tongue from blocking her throat, then positioned the BVM over her nose and mouth. "Okay, Mark, let's bag her." Mark began squeezing the bag with a practiced rhythm, once every 6 seconds, forcing life-giving oxygen into the woman's starving lungs. Chris watched her chest rise and fall with each manufactured breath, his mind racing through the overdose protocol. Opioids. It had to be. The pinpoint pupils, the respiratory depression. It was textbook. Time was the enemy. Every second her brain was deprived of oxygen increased the risk of permanent damage, or worse. "I'm drawing up Narcan," Chris announced, his hands moving with an efficiency that belied his 6 months of experience. He tore open the packaging for a vial of naloxone and a syringe. The small glass vial felt slippery in his sweat-dampened gloves. He drew up 2 milligrams, the standard starting dose. He needed to get this into her system. Fast. An IV line would be ideal, but finding a usable vein on a known or suspected IV drug user in a poorly lit alley was a low-percentage play. The next best route was intranasal. He attached an atomizer to the end of the syringe, a small device that would turn the liquid medication into a fine mist that could be absorbed through the mucous membranes in her nose. "Ready with the Narcan." Mark nodded, never breaking his rhythm with the BVM. The only sounds were the soft whoosh of the bag, Mark's calm counting, and the distant wail of a city siren. Chris leaned over the patient, placing the atomizer into her right nostril. He was about to depress the plunger, to push the life-saving antidote into her system, when a new sound cut through the alley's oppressive heat. It was the sound of heavy boot falls on gravel, moving quickly, deliberately. A shadow fell over him and the patient, large and imposing. "Step away from her. Now." The voice was a low growl, laced with an authority that expected instant obedience. Chris didn't look up. His entire world was this woman's airway, her failing pulse, the syringe in his hand. Every second was a universe. He couldn't afford the distraction. "Sir, I'm a paramedic," Chris said, his eyes still locked on the patient. "This woman is in respiratory arrest. I need to administer medication." "I said, step away!" The voice was closer now, louder, harder. "Police, let me see your hands and stand up." Chris felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was a complication he didn't need, a dangerous one. He knew he had to handle it, but his patient was his priority. She was his only priority. He made a split-second decision. The medicine came first. He pushed the plunger. 1 milligram of Narcan shot into her nostril. He shifted the atomizer to the other side. He had to get the full dose in. The woman on the ground didn't have time for a jurisdictional dispute. Before Chris could administer the second half of the dose, a hand clamped down on his shoulder, fingers digging into the muscle with surprising force. "Did you hear me? I said get up." Chris flinched, finally looking up from his patient. The man standing over him was a police officer, maybe in his mid-30s, with a bulldog jaw and a fresh buzz cut that did little to hide the angry flush creeping up his thick neck. His uniform was crisp, his name tag reading Miller. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were narrowed, fixed on Chris with an unnerving intensity. He wasn't assessing the medical scene. He was assessing a threat. "Officer, this is a medical emergency," Chris said, trying to keep his voice calm and professional, the way they taught in training. "My patient isn't breathing on her own. I am a licensed paramedic with the city fire department." Officer Miller's grip didn't loosen. His gaze flickered from Chris to the patient, then to the syringe still in Chris's hand. Suspicion radiated from him like heat from the asphalt. "What's that? What are you giving her?" "It's naloxone," Mark interjected, his voice as steady as his rhythm on the BVM. "Narcan. For an opioid overdose. Officer, we need to work. You're interfering." Miller seemed to register Mark for the first time, but his focus snapped right back to Chris, the person who had dared to ignore his initial command. "I'll determine who's interfering. I need to see your ID, both of you. Now." This was a critical juncture. The protocol was clear. Patient care takes precedence. A police officer's request for ID on an active scene was secondary to saving a life. Chris knew this. Mark knew this. But Miller's body language, the aggressive stance, the hand resting on his holstered firearm, suggested he operated under a different set of rules. "Our IDs are in the truck," Chris said, slowly and clearly, as if explaining something to a child. "My certification is right here on my uniform. We were dispatched to this location for a medical emergency. You can verify that with your dispatch. Right now. This woman's brain is being deprived of oxygen. I need to finish administering this medication, and we need to transport her immediately." He tried to turn his attention back to the patient, to deliver the 2nd milligram of Narcan, but Miller physically blocked him, stepping between Chris and the dying woman. The move was so deliberate, so contrary to any concept of emergency response, that it stunned Chris into silence for a second. "I give the orders here," Miller said, his voice dangerously low. "This is a potential crime scene. You are potential witnesses, or for all I know. You could be involved. You will show me your identification before you do anything else." The logic was so twisted it was almost surreal. Involved. They were in a fully marked ambulance, wearing official uniforms, providing medical care. The absurdity of the accusation was galling, but it was the deadly implication that terrified Chris. Miller wasn't just being difficult. He was actively obstructing medical treatment. He was creating a delay that could cost this woman her life. "Officer, with all due respect, you are wrong," Mark said, his voice losing its placid edge and taking on a new firmness. "State law protects us from interference during the administration of emergency medical care. You are breaking that law right now. Stand aside and let my partner do his job." Miller's head snapped toward Mark. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm stating a fact," Mark said. "Look at her. She is dying, and you are standing in the way." The friends of the patient, who had been watching in stunned silence, started to protest. "Hey, man, what are you doing?" the young man said, taking a hesitant step forward. "They're trying to help her." Miller's attention shot to the bystander. "You, get back, or you're next." He unclipped his radio from his belt. "Dispatch, 7-Adam-12. I'm at the scene in Alley 4. I have 2 uncooperative individuals claiming to be paramedics and a hostile crowd forming. I need backup." Uncooperative. Hostile. Chris felt like he'd fallen into an alternate reality. He looked at the patient. Her skin seemed grayer than a minute ago. The time for de-escalation was over. He had to act. He made his move, trying to reach around Miller to get the atomizer back to the patient's nose. It was a desperate, clumsy attempt, but it was all he could think to do. Miller's reaction was instantaneous. He shoved Chris backward, hard. Chris stumbled, catching his balance on the grimy brick wall. The syringe flew from his hand, skittering across the ground. The remaining dose of life-saving medicine was lost. The sight of the syringe skittering into the filth of the alley floor sent a jolt of pure, cold rage through Chris. It wasn't just a piece of plastic, it was a lifeline, and Miller had just snapped it with casual indifference. All the de-escalation training, all the lectures about maintaining professional composure, evaporated in the face of such reckless disregard for a human life. "What are you doing?" Chris yelled, his voice raw with disbelief. "She needs that medicine. You have no idea what you've just done." "I know I gave you a lawful order and you refused it," Miller shot back, his face contorted with anger. He seemed to thrive on the confrontation, his aggression feeding on Chris's desperation. "That's called obstruction. Now, you're going to stand against that wall, and you're not going to move." Mark, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, made one last attempt to appeal to reason. "Officer, listen to me. My partner is new. He's focused on the patient. Let's all just take a breath. The patient is the priority. We can sort out IDs and statements and whatever else you need after we get her to the hospital. Let us save her life first." For a fleeting moment, it seemed like Mark's calm, authoritative tone might break through. Miller hesitated, his eyes flickering between the 2 paramedics. But then his gaze landed back on Chris, who was staring at him with an expression of undisguised fury and contempt. Whatever internal battle Miller was fighting, Chris's defiance settled it. To him, this wasn't about a medical emergency anymore. It was about dominance. It was about who was in charge. He had his chance to cooperate. Miller snarled, pointing a thick finger at Chris. "You want to play doctor? Fine. But on my scene, you follow my rules." The patient on the ground chose that moment to make a sound, a horrifying, gurgling gasp. Her body went rigid, a slight tremor running through her limbs. "She's convulsing!" Mark shouted, his attention snapping back to her. "Probably from the hypoxia. Chris, I need the verst." The command was instinctual, a paramedic calling to his partner in a crisis. Chris reacted without thinking, his body moving toward the jump bag where the anti-seizure medication was stored. It was a single step, a pivot on the ball of his foot. But to Officer Miller, it was the final act of insubordination. "I told you not to move!" Miller roared. He lunged forward, not toward the seizing patient, but toward Chris. It all happened in a blur of motion. Miller was surprisingly fast. He closed the distance in 2 steps, grabbing the front of Chris's uniform and slamming him back against the brick wall. The impact knocked the wind out of Chris, his head smacking against the mortar with a dull thud. Stars exploded behind his eyes. Before he could recover, Miller had spun him around, wrenching his arm up behind his back in a move that sent a grinding pain shooting through his shoulder socket. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest," Miller grunted, the words hot and spit-flecked against Chris's ear. "Resisting? I'm trying to get medication!" Chris gasped, the pain in his shoulder making it hard to breathe. "My patient is seizing. Let me go!" Through the haze of pain and confusion, Chris could see the scene unfolding as if in a nightmare. Mark was alone, trying to manage the patient's airway with the BVM, while simultaneously trying to stop her from injuring herself as her body convulsed on the hard ground. The 2 friends were screaming now, the woman on her phone, likely calling 911 again, shouting that a cop was arresting the paramedic. The situation was pure chaos, a maelstrom of failed communication and brutal ego. And at the center of it was a young woman whose life was slipping away with every passing second. Miller's fury was so absolute, so disconnected from the reality of the emergency, that it felt like a force of nature. He wasn't a peace officer trying to secure a scene, he was a bully on a power trip. And he had found someone who refused to cower. Chris felt the cold, metallic click of handcuffs closing around his wrists. The sound was deafeningly final. He was a paramedic, on his knees in a filthy alley, in handcuffs, while his patient was dying just beyond his reach. This couldn't be happening. The click of the handcuffs was followed by a vicious yank that pulled Chris's shoulders to a point of screaming agony. Miller hauled him to his feet, his grip like a vice. "I gave you every chance to comply," Miller said, his voice a low, self-satisfied growl meant only for Chris. "This is on you. My patient," Chris choked out, twisting his head to try and see past Miller's bulk. "Mark, how is she?" "She stopped seizing, but she's going into V-fib." Mark's voice was strained, a frantic edge Chris had never heard before. Ventricular fibrillation. Her heart was no longer beating. It was just quivering uselessly. She was in cardiac arrest. "I need the monitor, the defibrillator, Chris!" Mark was calling for him, but Chris was shackled, powerless. Miller started marching him towards the alley's entrance, away from the scene, away from his partner, away from his patient. Each step felt like a betrayal of his oath. He could hear Mark struggling, wrestling the heavy cardiac monitor and defibrillator out of its compartment on the side of the ambulance. He was one man doing a 2-man job in the worst possible circumstances. "Officer, for God's sake, let me go," Chris pleaded, trying to dig his heels into the gravel. "She's in cardiac arrest. She's going to die. You have to let me help him." "You're not in a position to help anyone," Miller retorted, shoving him forward. "You should have thought about that before you decided to play hero." The phrase hung in the air, thick with irony. Play hero. It was the one thing Chris was trying to do, the one thing his job demanded, and he was being arrested for it. He could hear the high-pitched whine of the monitor charging. He knew the sounds by heart. The slap of defibrillator pads being pressed onto a chest. Mark's voice, clear and loud, commanding, "Clear!" There was a muffled thump as the electricity shot through the woman's body, a violent, last-ditch effort to shock her heart back into a viable rhythm. "No change, still in V-fib," Mark yelled. "Starting compressions." Chris could picture it perfectly. Mark, now on his knees over the patient, hands locked, pumping hard and fast on her chest, trying to manually circulate her blood while Miller dragged him away. The injustice was so profound, so absolute, it felt like a physical weight crushing his chest. He wasn't just being arrested, he was being made an accomplice to a potential homicide by negligence. As they reached the mouth of the alley, the wail of approaching sirens grew louder. Miller's backup was arriving. A second ambulance. 2. Someone must have gotten through. "See?" Miller said, as if the arriving units somehow vindicated his actions. "The situation is under control." He shoved Chris against the hot metal of his patrol car, the sun-baked hood searing through his uniform. The world outside the alley seemed bizarrely normal. Cars drove by on the main street, their drivers glancing over with mild curiosity. No one could know the life-or-death struggle happening just a few feet away. No one could see the profound wrongness of a paramedic in handcuffs while his partner fought a losing battle. Miller pushed his head down and forced him into the back of the patrol car. The cage was stiflingly hot, the air thick with the smell of cheap air freshener and old sweat. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing him in. Through the metal grill, Chris watched as 2 more police officers and another paramedic crew sprinted into the alley. They swarmed around the patient, a flurry of professional activity that he was now excluded from. He saw one of the new paramedics take over compressions from an exhausted-looking Mark. Another started an IV line. They were a well-oiled machine, doing exactly what he and Mark should have been allowed to do 10 minutes ago. 10 minutes in cardiac arrest. 10 minutes was an eternity. The damage was done. Those 10 minutes of argument, of ego, of obstruction, they would be the difference between life, a severely disabled life, and death. Miller got into the driver's seat, the car dipping with his weight. He didn't look back. He just started the engine, the air conditioning blasting on. A cold comfort in a moment of burning helplessness. As the car pulled away from the curb, Chris craned his neck, watching through the rear window as the team in the alley loaded the young woman onto a stretcher. Her body was limp. They were still doing compressions. He had failed her, not because he was incompetent, but because he had been stopped. The weight of that failure was suffocating. The drive to the precinct was a silent, surreal 10 minutes. The city slid past the windows, a blur of mundane life that felt like a mockery of the chaos Chris had just been ripped from. He sat stiffly in the back, the handcuffs biting into his wrists, replaying every second in the alley. What could he have done differently? Shown his ID immediately? But that would have meant stopping his initial assessment, delaying the oxygen, delaying the Narcan. The patient would have deteriorated either way. There had been no right answer, only a choice between his duty and an officer's demand. He had chosen his duty. He watched Officer Miller in the rearview mirror. The man's jaw was set, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He wasn't talking on the radio. He was just driving, radiating a tense, defensive silence. He knows he messed up, Chris thought with a flicker of bitter clarity. He's not justifying his actions anymore. He's just building the walls of his story. When they arrived at the station, Miller parked in the rear lot and walked Chris inside through a back entrance. A perp walk designed to minimize fuss. But the moment they stepped into the main bullpen, heads turned. The sight of a uniformed paramedic in handcuffs was an anomaly, a disruption to the daily rhythm of the precinct. "Miller, what the hell is this?" a gruff voice called out. A portly, gray-haired sergeant with a formidable mustache looked up from his desk, his pen hovering over a crossword puzzle. His eyes, framed by wrinkles of weary amusement, now held a sharp, inquisitive glint. "Arrested him for obstruction and resisting." "Sarge," Miller said, his voice a little too loud, a little too defensive. He pushed Chris forward toward the booking area. Interfering with a police investigation. The sergeant, whose nameplate read Rostova, pushed his chair back and stood up, his gaze sweeping over Chris. He took in the fire department patches, the paramedic certification pinned to his chest, the exhaustion and fury etched onto his young face. Rostova had been a cop for 30 years. He had a finely tuned instinct for when a story didn't add up, and this one was clanging like a 5-alarm fire bell. An investigation into what? Rostova asked, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. He's a medic. Was he on a call? It was a fluid situation, Miller said, using the kind of vague, non-committal language that cops use to obscure facts. The scene wasn't secure. He refused to identify himself. Rostova's eyes narrowed. He looked at Chris. Son, what's your name? Chris Jensen, sir, Chris said, his voice hoarse. My partner and I were treating a critical overdose patient in cardiac arrest. This officer prevented us from providing care. The sergeant's gaze flickered back to Miller. He didn't say anything, but his expression was a complex mixture of skepticism and concern. He had seen Miller's type before. Young. Aggressive officers who saw every interaction as a battle for dominance, who confused compliance with respect. They were often a liability waiting to happen. Take him to booking, Rostova said, his voice flat. But as Miller pushed Chris forward, the sergeant added, And Miller, I want your incident report on my desk before you even think about ending your shift. Every detail. The unspoken message was clear. This better be good. The booking process was a humiliating ordeal. His fingerprints were taken, the ink smearing on his fingers. A young officer who looked barely older than Chris took his mugshot, telling him to look straight ahead. He was instructed to remove his boots, his belt, and the contents of his pockets, his wallet, his keys, his phone, and his shears, the tool of his trade, which the booking officer handled as if it were a weapon. The officer cataloging his property, a young woman named Officer Davis, picked up his wallet. She opened it to log the contents and paused, pulling out his credentials. She laid them on the counter, his state paramedic license, his advanced cardiac life support card, his pediatric advanced life support card. She looked from the pristine, official documents to the man standing before her in his uniform and handcuffs. The disconnect was jarring. You were really on a call? She asked, her voice quiet, almost conspiratorial. Chris just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Davis's eyes held a flicker of sympathy before her professional mask slipped back into place. She finished logging his belongings and put them in a large manila envelope. The final indignity was being placed in a holding cell. The heavy metal door slammed shut, the sound echoing the finality he'd felt in the alley. He was officially a prisoner. He sat on the hard metal bench, the cold seeping through his uniform, through the bars. He could see the activity of the station, officers typing reports, laughing by the coffee machine. It was a world he was now completely separate from. He'd been in the cell for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes when Sergeant Rostova walked by. He didn't stop, but he slowed his pace, his eyes meeting Chris's for a brief second. There was no sympathy in the look, but there was something else, a flicker of acknowledgement, a sign that he wasn't just another faceless prisoner. Rostova knew something was wrong. And in the suffocating loneliness of the cell, that small, silent acknowledgement felt like the first glimmer of hope. The cell was a sterile box of concrete and steel, smelling faintly of disinfectant and despair. Chris leaned his head back against the cool cinder-block wall, closing his eyes and trying to force the image of his patient out of his mind. The cyanotic lips, the gurgling gasp, the violent shudder of the defibrillation. Had she made it to the hospital? Was she alive? The not knowing was a form of torture. He was a caregiver, hardwired to see a crisis through to its conclusion, and he had been ripped away at the most critical moment. He heard footsteps approaching, firm and purposeful, different from the heavy tread of the uniformed officers. He opened his eyes. A woman in a sharp, dark gray business suit stood outside his cell, holding a leather briefcase. She was in her late 40s, with dark, intelligent eyes and an expression that conveyed both empathy and a complete intolerance for bureaucratic nonsense. "Chris Jensen?" she asked, her voice crisp and clear. "Yes," he said, standing up and moving toward the bars. "My name is Elena Morales," she said, extending a business card through the bars. He took it. The card was thick, embossed. Elena Morales, attorney at law, civil rights and public advocacy. "Your partner, Mark Rivera, called your union rep the second he cleared the hospital. The rep called me. I've been on the phone with the city attorney's office for the last hour. Let's just say they're aware of the irregularities of your situation." Relief washed over Chris so intensely his knees felt weak. He hadn't been forgotten. Mark had come through. "My patient," he blurted out. "The woman in the alley, do you know what happened? Is she alive?" Morales' expression softened slightly. "That's the first question every single one of you asks. Mark said they were transporting her with a pulse when he last saw, but her condition was extremely critical. The hospital is holding her in the ICU. It's too soon to know more. Right now, our focus is on you." She pulled a small legal pad and a pen from her briefcase. "I need you to tell me everything that happened, from the moment you arrived on scene. Do not leave out a single detail, no matter how small. Don't interpret, just report. What you said, what Officer Miller said, what Mark said, the exact sequence of events." For the next half an hour, Chris recounted the entire nightmare, the patient's condition, his initial treatment, Miller's arrival, the demands for ID, the escalation, the physical assault, the arrest. Morales listened intently, her pen flying across the page, occasionally stopping him to ask a clarifying question. "Did he ever state what crime he was investigating?" she asked. "No, he just said it was a potential crime scene." "Did he ever ask about the patient's condition or offer to assist in any way?" "No. His only concern was that I follow his orders." "And you were physically assaulted and handcuffed after your patient went into cardiac arrest?" "No, just before," Chris corrected. The timeline seared into his memory. "He arrested me because I moved to get the anti-seizure medication when she started convulsing. Mark announced she was in V-fib after I was in cuffs." Morales paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw a flash of cold anger in her eyes. "Thank you for clarifying. That detail is significant." She closed her notepad. "Okay. Here's what's going to happen. This arrest is garbage. It's a textbook case of unlawful detention and interference with emergency medical services, which is a crime in this state. The charges of obstruction and resisting are baseless. You were performing your legal duty. The city knows they have a massive problem on their hands." She turned and gestured to Sergeant Rostova, who had been watching from his desk. "Sergeant, my client is being released on his own recognizance. The city attorney has already agreed. The paperwork should be on your desk." Rostova nodded slowly, picking up a freshly printed sheet from his tray. He read it, then looked over at Officer Miller, who was hunched over a computer terminal, likely still struggling with that incident report. There was no mistaking the look of profound disapproval on the veteran sergeant's face. "Get the door," Rostova ordered a younger officer. The sound of the cell door unlocking was the sweetest sound Chris had ever heard. He stepped out, his freedom feeling fragile and surreal. Morales handed him the manila envelope with his belongings. "The charges will be formally dropped by morning," she said as he put his belt back on and laced up his boots. "But this is not over. Not by a long shot. What happened in that alley was a violation of your civil rights and a catastrophic failure of public service that nearly killed a woman. The city will be held accountable for Officer Miller's actions. As Chris walked out of the precinct and into the late afternoon sun, the world felt tilted on its axis. He was free, but he didn't feel victorious. He felt hollowed out. Mark was waiting for him, leaning against the passenger side of their ambulance, which was parked across the street. His face was etched with worry. "You okay, kid?" Mark asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll live," Chris said. He took a deep breath. "Amelia, that's her name. What's the official word?" Mark's expression darkened. The grim reality of the situation settled back in, chasing away the brief relief of freedom. "It's not good, Chris. It's not good at all." "How bad is not good?" Chris asked, though he was almost afraid to hear the answer. In their line of work, not good was a euphemism that covered a universe of tragedies. Mark leaned back against the ambulance, the metal groaning under his weight. He looked older than he had that morning. "They got her heart restarted in the ER, ROSC, return of spontaneous circulation, but she was down for too long. The official diagnosis is severe hypoxic brain injury." The words landed like punches. Hypoxic brain injury. It was one of the most devastating outcomes. A nebulous territory between life and death. A person could survive, but the person they were before might be gone forever. They could be left in a persistent vegetative state, or with profound cognitive and physical disabilities. It was a life sentence of a different kind. "Those minutes," Chris said, his voice barely a whisper. "The time he spent arguing, the time she was seizing without medication, the time I was in handcuffs while you were doing compressions alone, that's what did it." "Yeah," Mark said, his jaw tight with a cold, hard anger. The ER doc was livid. He said the delay in definitive care was the clear cause. He's already documented it in her chart. He said, "Paramedics on scene were obstructed by law enforcement." He put it in writing, Chris, in the official medical record. That piece of information was a bombshell. A doctor's official note was a powerful piece of evidence, an objective, clinical condemnation of what Miller had done. Elena Morales, who had walked over with them, nodded grimly. "That doctor's note is the foundation of our case. This is no longer just your word against the officers. It's a medical fact, recorded in a legal document, that his actions directly caused harm to a patient." She looked at Chris, her expression serious. "Chris, I need to be very clear about what comes next. We are going to file a federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Miller and the city. We will be seeking damages for your unlawful arrest, false imprisonment, and the emotional distress this has caused. But more importantly, we will be filing on behalf of Amelia's family as well. Her life has been irrevocably altered because of his conduct. The city needs to answer for that." The scale of it was overwhelming. Lawsuits, federal court, damages. Just that morning, his biggest worry had been passing his 6-month probationary review. Now he was at the center of a legal firestorm. "Her family," Chris said, thinking of the frantic friends in the alley. "Do they know?" "The hospital has contacted her parents. They're on their way," Mark said. "They live out of state." "I'll be reaching out to them as soon as it's appropriate," Morales said. "To offer our services, pro bono if necessary. They deserve to know they have options." She turned her focus back to Chris. "The next few weeks will be difficult. The police union will defend Miller ferociously. They will try to paint you as inexperienced, insubordinate, and reckless. They will dig into your background, looking for anything they can use to discredit you. You need to be prepared for that." The thought of his own character being assassinated was nauseating, but the image of Amelia lying in an ICU bed, her future stolen from her, burned hotter than any personal fear. "I don't care what they say about me," Chris said, his voice finding a new strength. "They can't change what happened. They can't change the fact that he stopped me from doing my job. And she's the one who paid the price." Morales gave him a small, approving smile. "Good. That's the attitude we need." She looked from Chris to Mark. "You both need to write a full report of the incident. Tonight, while it's fresh. Every single detail. Mark, your testimony as a senior paramedic will be invaluable. Chris, your perspective is at the heart of the case. Document everything." As she walked away to make a call, Mark put a hand on Chris's shoulder. "Hey, you did everything right today, kid. You followed your training. You put the patient first. Don't let anyone, especially yourself, ever tell you otherwise. What that cop did, that was on him, all of it." The words of support from the man he respected more than anyone in his profession meant the world to him. But as he looked back at the cold, imposing facade of the police precinct, he knew that proving it would be the fight of his life. The advocate had arrived. The battle lines were drawn, but the war for justice had only just begun. The days that followed were a blur of administrative leave, formal interviews with fire department brass, and long meetings in Elena Morales's sterile, glass-walled office. The department, to its credit, stood by him unequivocally. The fire chief issued a public statement expressing deep concern over the incident and affirming his full support for his paramedics. It was a carefully worded piece of PR, but behind the scenes, the message was clear. The police department had crossed a line, and the fire department was not going to let it slide. It was during one of these meetings that Morales laid out the first concrete step. "We filed the lawsuit," she announced, sliding a thick document across the polished conference table. "Christopher Jensen and the estate of Amelia Reed versus Officer Brian Miller and the city. We're alleging violations under the 4th and 14th Amendments, specifically unlawful arrest and the deprivation of life and liberty without due process of law. We're also including state-level claims for false imprisonment, battery, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." The name hit him. Amelia Reed. Giving her a full name, a formal identity in a legal document, made the tragedy feel even more profound. She wasn't just the patient anymore. She was a person, an estate, a life that was now defined by what had been taken from her. "What's the latest on her condition?" Chris asked, his voice subdued. It was the question that haunted his waking moments and fueled his nightmares. Morales's expression was somber. "No change. She remains in a coma. The doctors have told her parents that the extent of the brain damage is catastrophic. They're facing an impossible decision about her future care." Chris felt a familiar wave of nausea. He looked down at the lawsuit, at his name next to hers. They were linked forever by this single, horrific event. The city's initial response came 2 weeks later. It wasn't a refutation of the facts or a defense of Miller's actions. It was an offer. "They're offering to settle," Morales said, her tone dripping with disdain. She slid another, much slimmer document across the table. "They're offering a total of $25,000. Chris stared at the number. $25,000 for everything? For my arrest? For what happened to her? "It's what we call a nuisance value offer," Morales explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. "It's the city's way of saying, we acknowledge this is a problem, but we think you'll take a small amount of money to make it go away quietly." It's an insult. It's their attempt to put a price tag on a ruined life and hope we're desperate enough to take it. "No," Chris said, the word coming out before he'd even consciously formed the thought. "Absolutely not." "I thought you'd say that," Morales said with a grim smile. I've already prepared our rejection. This isn't about a quick payday. This is about accountability. They think they can bury this. They think Officer Miller's report, which I've received a copy of, will protect them. She picked up another file. According to Miller, he arrived on scene to find you acting erratically over a suspected drug user. He claims you were uncooperative and aggressive when he requested identification to secure a potential crime scene. He alleges that you physically pushed him, which is when he was forced to take you into custody to ensure officer safety. There is no mention of a medical emergency in progress, no mention of your partner, no mention of the patient convulsing. That's all lies, Chris said, his blood running cold. Every word of it. Of course it is, Morales said calmly. It's a work of fiction, designed to justify the unjustifiable, and in most cases it works. It's one officer's word against an arrestee, but they've made a critical mistake. They've forgotten about the other witnesses. Mark, Chris said, and her friends. Exactly. Mark's official statement completely refutes Miller's. The two bystanders have also given statements that align with your version of events. But there's one witness that's even better. One that doesn't have biases or a faulty memory. One that the city is legally required to turn over to us in the discovery phase. Chris looked at her, confused. Who? Morales leaned forward, a predatory glint in her eyes. Officer Miller's body camera. The existence of the camera hadn't even occurred to him. In the chaos, he hadn't noticed the small black square on Miller's chest, but it was there. It had to be. It was mandatory department policy. They have to give it to us? Chris asked. They have no choice, Morales confirmed, and I suspect that once we see what's on that footage, the city's arrogant $25,000 offer is going to look like a very, very expensive mistake. That camera, Chris, is our smoking gun. It is the unblinking eye that will show the world exactly what happened in that alley. And it is going to tear Officer Miller's story to shreds. The legal battle settled into a long, grinding war of attrition. The city's lawyers, representing a powerful and well-funded institution, used every procedural tactic they could to slow things down. They filed motions to delay, motions to dismiss, motions to limit the scope of discovery. It was a classic strategy: drain the plaintiff's resources and resolve, hoping they would eventually give up or accept a paltry settlement. But they had underestimated Elena Morales. For every motion the city filed, Morales filed a counter-motion, sharp and meticulously researched. That dismantled their arguments. She was relentless, a legal pit bull who refused to let go. She knew the city's strategy was a bluff, a show of force to hide a weak hand. The longer they delayed turning over the body camera footage, the more certain she was of what it contained. They're scared, she told Chris during a weekly update call. Their motion to withhold the footage on the grounds that it's part of an ongoing internal investigation was just denied by the judge. They have to produce it by Friday. That Friday felt like the longest day of Chris's life. He met Morales at her office, his stomach in knots. They sat in a small viewing room, the lights dimmed. A technician queued up the file on a large monitor. "This is it," Morales said, her voice low. "Ready?" Chris nodded, his heart pounding. The footage began with a shaky view of Officer Miller's dashboard as he drove. The radio crackled with the initial dispatch call. Then, the car door opened, and the camera's view stabilized, showing the mouth of Alley 4. The audio was crystal clear. They heard Miller's heavy boot falls on the gravel. They saw the scene from his perspective. Mark bagging the patient, Chris kneeling, syringe in hand. And then they heard his voice, hard and commanding. "Step away from her, now!" They watched the entire incident unfold through Miller's own eyes. They saw Chris's brief, focused reply, his attempt to explain the situation. They saw Miller step forward, physically blocking access to the patient. They heard Mark's calm, rational intervention and Miller's aggressive dismissal of it. The camera captured it all: Miller's escalating anger, his distorted view of Chris's professional actions as personal defiance. The most damning moment came when the patient began to seize. On the video, her convulsion was clearly visible in Miller's line of sight. They heard Mark yell, "She's convulsing! Chris, I need the versed!" And they watched, in sickening high definition, as Miller ignored the dying woman and instead lunged for Chris the moment he moved for the medical bag. The camera spun wildly as he tackled Chris, the audio filled with grunts, the scrape of fabric against brick, and Chris's pained gasps. They watched the handcuffing. They heard Chris's desperate pleas to be allowed to help. They saw him being dragged away as Mark's frantic calls about VFib echoed in the alley. The footage continued, showing the back of Chris's head in the patrol car, the arrival of the other units, and finally, the drive to the station. Morales had the technician stop the video. The room was silent for a long moment. Chris sat staring at the black screen, his hands trembling. Seeing it from that perspective, hearing it all again, was profoundly disturbing. It was also, in a strange way, incredibly validating. "There it is," Morales said, her voice a mixture of quiet fury and grim satisfaction. His entire written report is a lie. The video proves he wasn't securing a scene. He was creating a crisis. It proves he saw her seize and chose to arrest you instead of letting you treat her. It proves you never pushed him, never resisted, never did anything but try to save a life. This is indefensible. She was right. The footage was a second-by-second chronicle of Miller's catastrophic failure of judgment, his prejudice, and his aggression. It was the city's worst nightmare, captured by their own technology. Armed with this undeniable evidence, Morales went on the offensive. She scheduled depositions, starting with the key players, Mark, the two bystander friends, the ER doctor, and the man himself, Officer Brian Miller, the city's attorneys, now aware that Morales had the footage. Filed an emergency motion for a protective order, trying to prevent the video from being used in depositions or released to the public. The judge, a no-nonsense former prosecutor, all but laughed them out of court. "Your officer's actions are a matter of public concern," he stated in his ruling. "You don't get to hide the evidence of his conduct simply because it is embarrassing to the city." Motion denied. The city's wall of arrogant denial was beginning to crumble. They had started this fight believing they held all the cards, that the word of a police officer was unassailable. But the first salvo in this war had been fired, and thanks to the unblinking eye of a body camera, it had been a direct hit. The truth was out, and it was coming for them. The deposition of Officer Brian Miller took place in a sterile conference room in a downtown law office. It was a neutral ground, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. Miller sat at one end of a long, polished table, flanked by two attorneys from the city's legal department and a grim-faced lawyer from the police union. He was wearing a suit, a stark contrast to the uniform he'd worn in the alley, but he couldn't disguise the same bulldog belligerence in his posture. Chris was there, sitting beside Elena Morales. His presence was a strategic choice. Morales wanted Miller to have to look at the man whose life he had upended while he tried to defend his lies. Morales began calmly, almost conversationally, establishing the basic facts of Miller's career. 8 years on the force, a decorated officer, a member of the SWAT team. She was lulling him into a false sense of security. Then she shifted gears. "Officer Miller, I'd like to direct your attention to your official report regarding the arrest of my client, Mr. Jensen. You have a copy in front of you?" Miller grunted an affirmative. "In this report," Morales said, her voice hardening slightly, "you state that upon arriving at the scene, you observed the suspect acting erratically. Could you please describe this erratic behavior for us?" "He was agitated," Miller said, his voice flat. He was ignoring my commands. His focus was intense, unnatural. He was a paramedic treating a patient who wasn't breathing. Officer, wouldn't you expect his focus to be intense? Objection. The union lawyer interjected. Argumentative. I'll rephrase, Morales said smoothly. What specific actions did Mr. Jensen take that you interpreted as erratic? He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't show me his ID. He was hiding what he was doing with the patient, Miller recited, as if reading from a script. Hiding it? Morales repeated, a note of incredulity in her voice. He was in a public alley, in broad daylight, wearing a full paramedic uniform, with his partner right next to him. What do you believe he was trying to hide? I couldn't know at the time, Miller said, shifting in his chair. It was a fluid situation. Morales let the silence hang for a moment before moving on. Your report states that Mr. Jensen aggressively refused to provide identification. Let's be precise. Did he say no? I will not show you my ID? He was evasive. He said it was in the truck. He was making excuses. Or was he, as a trained medical professional, explaining that his patient was in a state of respiratory arrest and that providing immediate medical care was his priority? That's his version, Miller sneered. Let's consult a different version, shall we? Morales said, nodding to the technician in the corner. Please play Exhibit A. The body camera footage, starting at timestamp 14:02:30. The large screen on the wall flickered to life. The conference room was filled with the sounds of the alley, of Miller's own voice barking commands. Miller's eyes were glued to the screen. He was watching himself, a passenger in his own memory. Morales paused the video after Chris's first interaction. Officer, on the screen, we see my client kneeling over a patient. We hear him say, "Sir, I'm a paramedic. This woman is in respiratory arrest." Does that sound like an aggressive refusal to you? Miller's jaw tightened. His tone was insubordinate. Insubordinate? Morales pounced on the word. Are paramedics your subordinates, officer? Is the fire department under the command of the police department at a medical scene? Objection, the city lawyer snapped. Sustained, Morales said, surprising everyone. He's already answered the question. His mindset is clear. She had Miller's prejudice on the record. She continued this way for 3 hours, meticulously dissecting Miller's report and contrasting it with the video evidence. The erratic behavior was shown to be focused medical care. The aggressive refusal was a calm, professional explanation. The fluid situation was a clear medical emergency that Miller was actively ignoring. The final nail in the coffin was the seizure. Morales played the clip of Amelia's body convulsing, of Mark shouting for the verst. She froze the frame at the exact moment Miller lunged, not toward the patient, but toward Chris. Officer Miller, she said, her voice now cold as ice. Your report states, the suspect then physically assaulted me by pushing me in the chest, at which point I was forced to use the necessary force to take him into custody. Please show me on this video, your video, where my client pushes you. The room was dead silent. All eyes were on the frozen image on the screen. It showed Chris pivoting, his hands empty and moving toward the medical bag. It showed Miller initiating all the contact, all the violence. Miller stared at the screen, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He had no answer. His union lawyer leaned over and whispered something in his ear. My recollection in the report, Miller stammered. It was based on my perception of a rapidly evolving, threatening situation. Your perception, Morales repeated, letting the words sink in. So your perception was that a 5'10", 170-pound paramedic moving to get life-saving medication for a seizing patient was a greater threat than the seizing patient herself? Miller was trapped. His lies were exposed, his narrative shattered, not by testimony or argument, but by his own unblinking digital eye. He sat there under the fluorescent lights, a man undone by a few megabytes of data. The deposition was a brutal, systematic dismantling of a lie, and everyone in the room knew that the city's case had just died on that conference room table. The fallout from Miller's disastrous deposition was immediate. The city's lawyers, who had entered the room with an air of dismissive confidence, left with the pale, shaken look of people who had just watched their entire defense strategy go up in flames. The union attorney, usually a bulldog in litigation, was uncharacteristically silent. They knew with absolute certainty that if a jury ever saw that video and heard that deposition testimony, the verdict would be financially catastrophic for the city. The very next morning, Elena Morales' phone rang. It was the lead attorney for the city. The arrogant tone was gone, replaced by one of weary pragmatism. "Elena," he said, "I think it's time we had a serious conversation about resolving this matter. We'd like to propose mediation." Mediation was a form of structured negotiation, overseen by a neutral third party, usually a retired judge. It was a last-ditch effort to settle a case before it went to a full, public trial. It was also a clear signal of surrender. "I thought you might," Morales replied, a hint of steel in her voice. "We're available to meet. But let me be clear. The conversation will not be starting anywhere near your previous offer. In fact, if the number you have in mind has less than 7 figures in it, don't bother wasting our time." They met 2 weeks later in the office of the mediator, a widely respected retired federal judge named Arthur Vance. Judge Vance had a reputation for being tough, fair, and having an uncanny ability to cut through legal posturing. The city's team came armed with risk assessment charts and actuarial tables, trying to frame the discussion as a matter of financial liability management. They started by offering $500,000. Morales didn't even counter. She simply turned to the technician she had brought along and said, "Please play the first 5 minutes of Exhibit A." They all sat in silence as the body camera footage filled the room. Judge Vance watched, his expression unreadable, but his focus absolute. Morales stopped the video just after Miller arrested Chris. Then, she presented her own materials. She laid out the ER doctor's report, highlighting the phrase, "obstructed by law enforcement." She presented the prognosis from 3 different neurologists, all of whom agreed that Amelia Reed's brain damage was permanent and profound, and that she would require round-the-clock medical care for the rest of her life. She showed them the estimated lifetime cost of that care, a number that was staggering. Finally, she read key excerpts from Miller's deposition transcript, his stammering, contradictory answers echoing in the quiet room. When she was finished, she looked at the city's attorneys, and then at Judge Vance. "My client was arrested for saving a life. His patient, a 22-year-old woman named Amelia Reed, will never walk, talk, or feed herself again because of the delay in care Officer Miller caused. This isn't a nuisance. This isn't a liability calculation. This is a catastrophe brought on by the actions of a city employee who was improperly trained, poorly supervised, and pathologically incapable of admitting a mistake. The city's offer is an insult not only to Mr. Jensen, but to the memory of the person Miss Reed used to be." Judge Vance let her words settle. He then separated the 2 parties, a standard mediation practice. He spent an hour with the city's team first. When he emerged, he had the grim look of a man who had just delivered very bad news. He then met with Chris and Morales. "They understand their position now," he said bluntly. "They know that a jury will crucify them. The footage is worse than you described. It's a textbook civil rights violation. The only question now is the number." The negotiations went on for the rest of the day. The city's offer crept up, first to 1 million, then 2, then 5. Morales held firm. She wasn't just negotiating for money, she was negotiating for a number so large it would force the city to take systemic action. Finally, late in the evening, they arrived at a number. The city agreed to a settlement of $16.5 million. The sum was breathtaking. $10 million would be placed in a trust to fund Amelia Reed's lifelong medical care. $3 million would go to her parents for their loss and suffering, and $3.5 million would go to Chris for the violation of his rights, the damage to his reputation, and the trauma he had endured. But Morales had demanded more than just money. The settlement included non-monetary terms that were, in her mind, even more important. The city had to agree to them, or she would walk away and take her chances with a jury. The price of this injustice wasn't just going to be paid in dollars, it was going to be paid in change. The news of the $16.5 million settlement sent shockwaves through the city's political and legal establishments. It was one of the largest civil rights settlements in the state's history, a staggering sum that made front-page headlines. But for Chris and Elena Morales, the true victory lay buried in the fine print of the agreement. In the non-monetary terms, the city had been forced to accept. The first and most immediate consequence was the termination of Officer Brian Miller. The settlement agreement mandated an immediate internal affairs review with access to all evidence from the civil case. Faced with the undeniable body camera footage and his perjurious deposition, the police department had no choice. Miller was fired for gross misconduct, untruthfulness, and violating the civil rights of a citizen. The police union filed a grievance, but it was a token gesture. Miller's career in law enforcement was over, but Morales had pushed for more than just the removal of one bad apple. She had argued successfully that Miller was not an anomaly, but a symptom of a systemic cultural problem within the department. The settlement, therefore, required the police department to completely overhaul its training protocols regarding interactions with emergency medical personnel. This new training module, which cops grimly and unofficially dubbed the Miller Protocol, was mandatory for every sworn officer, from the rawest recruit to the chief of police. It used the body camera footage from the alley as a case study in what not to do. It explicitly taught that a declared medical emergency, being handled by certified medical professionals, takes legal and tactical precedence over an officer's administrative demands. It codified the understanding that paramedics and EMTs are not subordinates to be commanded, but partners in public safety whose medical authority on a scene is absolute. Furthermore, the agreement mandated the creation of a new early intervention system. This computer program would track officer behavior, flagging individuals who, like Miller, accumulated multiple citizen complaints, use of force incidents, or, most specifically, grievances from other city agencies like the fire department. An officer who was flagged would be automatically assigned to remedial training, counseling, and placed under closer supervision. It was a system designed to catch the next Brian Miller before he could cause a tragedy. For Chris, watching these changes be implemented was more satisfying than any monetary sum. His ordeal had been transformed from a personal trauma into a catalyst for institutional reform. He had been a rookie paramedic who found himself in an impossible situation, but his refusal to back down had forced a powerful, change-resistant institution to look in the mirror and confront its own failings. He met with Amelia Reed's parents, a quiet, heartbroken couple from Ohio who had moved to be near the long-term care facility where their daughter would now live. They sat in a sterile hospital conference room, the air thick with unspoken grief. There were no words Chris could offer that would fix their shattered lives, but he could offer the truth. He told them about their daughter's last conscious moments, about how hard he had tried to save her. Amelia's father, a stoic man with calloused hands, reached across the table and shook Chris's hand. "You did everything you could, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You fought for her in that alley, and you fought for her in that courtroom. You're the only good thing to come out of this whole damn mess." His words were a small measure of peace, a balm on a wound that Chris knew would never fully heal. The money in the trust would ensure Amelia received the best possible care for the rest of her life, but it would never give her back her future. The settlement was not a victory in that sense. It was a reckoning. It was the price the city had to pay for a culture of arrogance and a single officer's unchecked ego, and it was a price so steep it would guarantee that no one in a position of power would ever forget the name Chris Jensen or the lesson he had forced them to learn. The impact of Chris's case soon rippled beyond the city limits. The story, amplified by the staggering settlement amount and the damning body camera footage, which Morales' team successfully petitioned the court to release publicly, became a national talking point. It was picked up by news outlets, legal journals, and medical trade publications. The video of a paramedic being arrested while his patient lay dying became a viral symbol of the potential conflict between law enforcement and emergency medical services. Legislators at the state capitol took notice. A bipartisan group of lawmakers, spurred by powerful lobbying from the state's firefighter and paramedic unions, saw an opportunity to prevent such an incident from ever happening again. They drafted a new piece of legislation, which they called the Medical Priority Act. The bill was simple but revolutionary. It legally codified the principle that certified emergency medical responders, when actively engaged in patient care during a medical emergency, have primary authority over the patient's treatment. The law explicitly made it a felony for any person, including a sworn peace officer, to willfully obstruct or interfere with the lawful duties of a paramedic or EMT. It provided first responders with legal protection, a shield against the kind of abuse of authority that Chris had faced. Chris was invited to testify before the state legislature's Public Safety Committee. He sat at a long table, facing a panel of senators and representatives, and told his story. He didn't use legal jargon or dramatic rhetoric. He just calmly and factually recounted the events in the alley, the choices he made, and the catastrophic consequences of Officer Miller's interference. Every paramedic and EMT is taught from day one that the patient is our one and only priority, he said, his voice steady. We take an oath to do no harm and to provide care to anyone who needs it. But what happens when that oath comes into conflict with a police officer's order? Who do we obey? The law should be clear. Our duty is to our patient. This bill makes that duty the law. He was followed by Amelia Reed's father, Mr. Reed. A man unaccustomed to public speaking, stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded a piece of paper. He spoke not of legal principles, but of his daughter. He talked about the young woman she had been, vibrant, funny, a recent college graduate with dreams of becoming a graphic designer. Then he described the woman she was now, trapped in a body that no longer responded, her brilliant mind silenced forever. My daughter is alive today because a young paramedic named Chris Jensen refused to stop trying to save her, he said, his voice cracking. She is in the state she's in today because his efforts were stopped by a police officer who was more concerned with paperwork than a human life. How many more Amelias must there be before we make it clear who is in charge when someone is dying? Pass this bill. Do it for the next first responder who has to make that choice. Do it for the next patient whose life hangs in the balance. His testimony was devastatingly effective. The committee room was silent. The legislators visibly moved. The Medical Priority Act passed through the committee unanimously. 2 months later, it was signed into law by the governor. At the signing ceremony, Chris stood beside the governor, a symbol of the change his ordeal had brought about. His single traumatic experience had become a catalyst, creating a legal precedent that would protect thousands of his fellow first responders across the state for years to come. It was a profound and unexpected legacy, born from the worst day of his life. Life, for Chris, did not simply return to normal. There was no normal to return to. He was no longer an anonymous rookie paramedic. He was a public figure, the face of a landmark legal case. He was also, now, a millionaire. The combination was disorienting. He took an extended leave of absence from the fire department, trying to process the trauma of the past year and figure out what to do with the resources and the platform he now possessed. He could have easily walked away. He could have bought a house on a beach, traveled the world, and never set foot in an ambulance again. No one would have blamed him, but the call to serve, the fundamental reason he had become a paramedic in the first place, was still there. The problem was that his experience had exposed him to a different kind of emergency, not just the medical crises of individuals, but the systemic failures that allowed those crises to turn into tragedies. The memory of Amelia Reed was a constant presence. He knew her trust fund would provide for her physical needs, but what about the root cause of her initial emergency? The opioid addiction that had brought her to that alley. He learned that she had been struggling for years, cycling in and out of rehab facilities, her family desperate to help but lost in a confusing and often punitive system. His purpose began to crystallize. The settlement wasn't a prize to be enjoyed. It was a tool to be used. He met with Elena Morales, not as a client, but as a collaborator. Together, they began to lay the groundwork for a new nonprofit organization. He named it the Amelia Project. Its mission was twofold. First, it would be a harm reduction organization, providing outreach, clean supplies, and fentanyl testing strips to active drug users on the streets. It was a pragmatic approach, focused on keeping people alive long enough to have a chance at recovery. Second, it would be a patient advocacy service, helping individuals and families navigate the labyrinthine world of addiction treatment, insurance coverage, and recovery housing. It would be a resource to help people before they ended up unresponsive in a dark alley. Chris poured a significant portion of his settlement, over $1 million, into launching the foundation. He rented a small office space, hired a small staff of social workers and peer support specialists, recovering addicts themselves, and began the hard work of building something new. It was a world away from the adrenaline-fueled life of a paramedic, but it was just as demanding. Instead of sirens and trauma shears, his tools were now grant proposals, community outreach meetings, and one-on-one counseling sessions. He learned about the deep-seated societal issues that fueled addiction, poverty, trauma, mental illness, and despair. He often thought about Officer Miller. He realized with a startling clarity that Miller had looked at Amelia and seen not a patient, but a junkie. He had seen a crime, not a disease. That prejudice, that dehumanization, was at the heart of what went wrong in the alley. It had allowed Miller to see her life as less valuable than his own authority. The Amelia Project was Chris's answer to that prejudice. It was a declaration that every life was worth saving, that compassion was a more powerful tool than contempt, and that a person's worst moment did not define their worth. He was still a first responder. He realized he was just responding to a different kind of call now, a slower, more complex emergency that didn't end when the ambulance doors closed. It was the work of healing, not just bodies, but communities. It was a living tribute to the woman he couldn't save, a way to ensure her story would lead to salvation for others. A year after the settlement, Chris put the uniform back on. The Amelia Project was up and running, in the capable hands of the director he had hired. It was making a tangible difference. But Chris felt a pull back to the streets, back to the ambulance. It was who he was. The administrative work of the foundation was important, but the hands-on work of emergency medicine was his calling. He returned to his old station, to his old shift, and to his partner, Mark Rivera. Things were different now. The rookies looked at him with a kind of awe. The veterans treated him with a new level of respect. He was no longer just Chris, the promising new guy. He was a living legend, the paramedic who had taken on the police department and won. The story was told in every firehouse in the city. The body camera footage, a required part of training for both new firefighters and new police recruits. His first shift back, they were dispatched to a multi-vehicle accident on the interstate. As they pulled up, a police car was already on scene, an officer directing traffic around the mangled vehicles. The officer was young, his face still fresh and unlined by cynicism. He saw the ambulance and immediately jogged over. "Paramedics!" he called out, a note of relief in his voice. "We've got 2 critical patients in the minivan. The scene is secure. Let me know what you need from us. We'll keep the area clear for you." Chris and the young officer locked eyes for a brief moment. There was an unspoken understanding there. This officer had been trained under the new protocols. He had seen the video. He understood the roles, the boundaries, the partnership. He saw Chris not as a subordinate, but as a fellow professional with a different, more urgent job to do at that moment. "Thanks, officer," Chris said with a nod. "We'll take it from here." The interaction was seamless, professional, and respectful. It was exactly how it was supposed to work. This small, mundane moment on a busy highway was the proof that the change was real. It wasn't just a law on paper or a new paragraph in a training manual. It was a cultural shift. But the scars of his ordeal remained. He still felt a spike of anxiety whenever a police car pulled up to one of his scenes. He was more cautious in his interactions, more deliberate in his language, always aware of the potential for conflict. The trauma had changed him, leaving him wiser but also warier. It was a weight he would carry for the rest of his career. His story became a teaching tool, a cautionary tale used in academies and lecture halls across the country. It illustrated the dangers of unchecked authority, the critical importance of interagency cooperation, and the profound responsibility that came with wearing a badge or a uniform. It taught a generation of police, paramedics, and firefighters that saving a life always took precedence over winning an argument. Chris never sought the spotlight. He turned down book deals and movie offers. He preferred the relative anonymity of his 24-hour shifts, the simple, profound satisfaction of helping a person through the worst day of their life. He ran the calls, stabilized the patients, and transported them to the hospital, just as he had been trained to do. But he had become more than just a paramedic. He was a symbol. He was a reminder that one person, armed with the truth and the courage to stand by their convictions, could change the system. He had faced down an abuse of power and emerged not just intact, but stronger, transforming his personal tragedy into a legacy of protection and advocacy for all who would come after him. He was a healer, in more ways than one, still working on the front lines, his sacred duty to his patients now enshrined in the very laws of the state he served. Years passed. Chris's hair had a few more flecks of gray at the temples, and the lines around his eyes were etched a little deeper, but the calm competence in his hands never wavered. He became a senior paramedic, a mentor to the new generation of EMTs who came through the station doors, kids with the same mix of terror and excitement he once had. To them, the Miller incident was a piece of department history, a legendary case study they watched on a screen. To Chris, it remained a collection of sensory memories, the grit of asphalt on his cheek, the blinding sun, the horrifying gurgle in Amelia's throat. The Amelia Project flourished, with the support of city grants and private donations. It grew into one of the region's most effective harm reduction and recovery advocacy groups. It saved countless lives, not with Narcan and defibrillators, but with compassion, resources, and a refusal to see addiction as a moral failing. On the wall of the main office hung a single, beautifully rendered graphic design, a stylized phoenix rising from ashes. It had been found on Amelia Reed's laptop, a personal project she was working on before she died. Her parents had given it to Chris. It was a reminder of the vibrant, creative spark that had been extinguished, and the enduring purpose that had risen in its place. Chris never saw Brian Miller again. He heard through the grapevine that Miller had moved out of state. Working in private security, a bitter man convinced he was the victim of a political witch hunt. He never took responsibility, never showed remorse. His inability to see past his own ego had cost a woman her future and a city millions of dollars. Yet in his own mind, he was the one who had been wronged. The ambulance still carried Chris through the city's veins, to its darkest alleys and its most desperate moments. He still felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the quiet focus descending as he stepped out to face another crisis. He was forever changed by that day, more aware of the fragility of both life and justice. He had learned that the most dangerous weapon an officer carried wasn't their gun, but their pride. And the most important tool a paramedic had wasn't in their jump bag, but in their unwavering commitment to the patient above all else. His duty was sacred, a vow he had kept under the worst possible pressure, and in doing so, had carved out a space of safety for every first responder who followed in his footsteps. The scars remained, but so did the purpose, clearer and stronger than ever before. The story of Chris Jensen and Brian Miller is more than a simple conflict between two individuals. It's a collision of two professional cultures. Miller's actions didn't spring from a vacuum of pure malice. They were the toxic culmination of a mindset that prioritizes absolute control and views any questioning of authority as a direct, personal threat. For an officer like Miller, whose sense of self-worth may have been deeply entangled with the power of his badge, Chris's calm, professional focus on his patient felt like insubordination. In Miller's world, there was a clear hierarchy, and he was at the top. He couldn't comprehend a situation where another professional's duty superseded his own command. This wasn't just a bad decision. It was a catastrophic failure of imagination, fueled by insecurity and inadequate training in de-escalation and interagency cooperation. Could this have been avoided? Perhaps. If Chris had been a 15-year veteran like Mark, he might have used a different tone, a different tactic to placate the officer's ego without compromising his patient. If Miller had received training that forced him to confront his own biases, to see the person in crisis and not just the junkie, he might have recognized the medical emergency for what it was. The tragedy lies in how easily it could have been different. A single moment of humility, of one professional deferring to another's expertise, would have saved a life from ruin. This story is a brutal reminder that true strength isn't demonstrated by forcing compliance, but by having the wisdom to recognize when your authority is not the most important thing in the room. The ultimate measure of a public servant is their ability to serve the public's greatest need, and in that moment, the need was medical, not legal. What do you think is the single most important factor that led to this tragic outcome? The officer's personality, his training, or the department's culture? How can we better train our first responders, both police and medical, to work together and prevent these kinds of conflicts before they start?